Welcome viewers, Dr. JWAU. Could Australia learn from what happened at Europe's southern border before facing similar pressures itself? Ceuta is thousands of kilometres from Australia, yet the interview argues that its significance extends far beyond Spain. It presents the border surge not simply as an immigration event, but as an example of how migration incentives, political encouragement and border management can combine to place unexpected pressure on nations' civilizations. This quick presentation asks a preventative question. If one democratic nation can be surprised by the cumulative consequences of its migration encouragement policies, what lessons should Australia examine before similar pressure emerge here?
Now, EU member states are turning on Spain after Friday saw 60,000 migrants cross from Morocco to the Spanish enclave of Ceuta. Italy has responded by suspending the EU Schengen agreement with Spain that allows for free movement between the two countries. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has criticised what he described as their selfish, polarising and illegal reaction to the mass border crossings. Well, joining us to discuss all is the Times Europe editor, Peter Conradi. Good afternoon, Peter.
Good afternoon.
Peter, can you just give us a sense of why these migrants so suddenly streamed into Ceuta in the middle of this week?
That is the big question. We should explain Ceuta, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, to be honest, is, a bit of, it's technically an exclave, so it's a little bit of Spanish territory, not to be confused with an enclave, an exclave, which is a bit of Spanish territory on the sort of a tip of Africa, surrounded by Moroccan territory. And, but it is part of Spain. And what apparently seems to have been happening was that over the past few days, the people were beginning to go in relatively small numbers from Morocco, crossing through the water into Ceuta. And they were sort of inspired, it seems, in part by the fact that there was an amnesty which the Spanish government declared, which ran from April until the end of June, for people, illegal migrants, to kind of in Spain to regularise their situation. So that seemed to be having an effect, even though that had long since expired. Then there was something else which came, which was there was a judgment by Spain's highest court saying that although people that crossed by land into Spain could be pushed back, those that crossed by water into Spain couldn't be, which meant that if you actually swum round the bit of projecting, the bit sticking out into the sea, up here or whatever, you could find your way into Ceuta, and they thought not be sent back. And then on this sort of seemed to spread on social media. And according to a version which is emerging in Spain, the Moroccan government, who always has a slightly tense relationship with Spain, appears to have encouraged it a bit. And then suddenly the whole thing, as always happens with social media, really took off, and there were 60,000 people trying to push their way across.
I mean, in a city that has 85,000 inhabitants, I mean, those numbers are extraordinary, aren't they, Peter? And the scenes were extraordinary this week. Now, there's been an interesting response from other EU countries. Explain what's been happening.
Yeah, well, now, Spain is a bit of an outlier when it comes to immigration policy, because the rest of Europe, almost every country in Europe, has been tightening their policy on immigration, has been talking tough on immigration, either because they themselves are on the right or because they fear the far right, particularly coming to power. Spain is the big difference from that, because Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister, is a socialist, and he's pursuing a completely different policy, which is to say, look, migration is actually quite a good thing. It's good for our economy. It helps us to grow. We've got an aging population, not enough people are having kids, all this kind of stuff. And of course, the amnesty, which I just mentioned. So this has put him at odds with almost everyone else in Europe. So therefore, when this happened, the other European countries, led by Giorgia Meloni, jumped in and were very, very quick to blame him. And he, of course, retaliated and sort of put up a very, very angry statement on social media, criticising, which you just quoted from, criticising the selfish, polarising and unlawful reaction of all his neighbours. So quite a mess, really.
I understand Denmark's also waded in quite heavily, almost from the other side on this.
Yeah, no, Denmark is always an interesting example, because the Prime Minister there, Mette Frederiksen, is a social democrat, but she's a social democrat who is tough on immigration. I mean, maybe not unlike the British Home Secretary. And in fact, Labour appears to be taking some of its policies from Denmark. So she basically was very quickly to join Giorgia Meloni, who's been leading the attack on Spain. And I mean, Italy's been doing more than talking. It is actually said that it is going to suspend the Schengen Agreement, which is sort of the free movement agreement between 29 European countries, as far as people coming from Spain are concerned. So if you come from Spain to Italy, necessarily by plane or by boat, because there's no land border, the Italians have said, right, we reserve the right to check your passport. So they've, in a sense, that will be sort of like a temporary suspending of the Schengen rules, which you're allowed to do, but only vis-a-vis Spain.
Peter, will these sort of punitive actions continue, do we think, given that most of the migrants who flooded across the border during the week have actually now been returned?
Well, I mean, that's the sort of the crazy thing about it, because this flared up very dramatically, very suddenly. But in terms of the immediate problem, has been resolved extraordinarily quickly, because all but 2,000, I think, of the people that came were persuaded, in inverted commas, or voluntarily, went back to Morocco. So,
viewers, I don't believe that to be true.
I mean, the whole thing is really very odd, because it's essentially, another 2,000 people is another 2,000 people, but it's not an enormous amount. And in fact, interestingly, in the broader context in Europe is that the number of people crossing irregularly into the Schengen area is about 49% down on last year, which doesn't really fit public perceptions that everything is getting worse and worse and worse, but is the reality. And in fact, as Spain has pointed out quite gleefully, it is much better at stopping illegal migrants coming into its country than Italy is in stopping them coming to it.
Yeah.
"60,000 people pour across the border from Morocco into Ceuta, littering the beach with discarded rubber rings. Young and old, families, babies. Mostly coming by sea, dozens have died trying. I saw hell, says Abdul Hakim, who was stopped at the border. We walked 14 kilometres through the mountains, but told ourselves it didn't matter as long as the border was open. We were told to take the road to the sea. I found myself completely submerged. I was choking, and I saw 2 men die right before my eyes." The tiny Spanish territory seems like a safe bet for these migrants after a supposed legal loophole issued by the Spanish Supreme Court said migrants intercepted at sea can't be summarily returned, triggering a run on the border. It seems, says Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, that this interpretation of the sentence of the Supreme Court has spread like wildfire in the last hours among human trafficking networks and produced an avalanche with the characteristics and dimension we've seen here. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it's caused an almighty diplomatic row in Europe. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni temporarily ousting Spain from the Schengen Agreement, which guarantees the free movement of people within Europe's borders. Leaders outside the EU keen to highlight their own immigration policies, protect them from events like these.
People will see those scenes and want something to be done, more to be done. What I have done is firstly keep the current Home Secretary in place, because the plan she has implemented has started to make a difference. Although this is the peak period of the year for crossings, overall the number of crossings is down, the number of removals of people is up. So there is progress, but we both recognise that we need to do more.
If we're not in office, our country will be invaded at levels that made Spain look small time. When you look at what happened to Spain, they don't know what to do. And it's happening again today. They're coming in by the tens of thousands. They're just invading the country.
There are normally only 84,000 people living on Ceuta, this influx taking its toll immediately. People don't want to go out, says this shopkeeper, asking us a lot to deliver to their homes. Given the situation, they're a bit scared. Spain's military has been sent in to reinforce the border. Authorities promising to speed up deportations, claiming half of those who come here have already gone back. But the huge tides of people arriving in Ceuta keep coming. Olivia Guthrie, ITV News.
Tens of thousands of migrants streamed into the Spanish territory of Ceuta on the north coast of Africa on Thursday. They got around the border fence by swimming or pushing through the wire. Spain's Prime Minister blames trafficking networks for spreading misleading information online, suggesting that migrants arriving by sea would be allowed to stay in the country. That's after a court ruling in July limited the government's ability to send back migrants entering the country without proper documents.
What we're doing is speeding up everything related to the processing. Of course it isn't.
I spent maybe 14 years for studying, but nothing. Just sitting in your home or working for 12 hours for a less salary. So that's why I come into here. But also here, I didn't find any opportunity, so I should go back.
The incident prompted strong reaction in Europe. Italy's Prime Minister announced the temporary suspension of free movement with Spain. Giorgia Meloni said the images demonstrated that illegal immigration poses a concrete threat to the security of Europe's borders. The head of the European Commission called the situation unacceptable. And across the Atlantic, US President Donald Trump used the incident to criticize the Democrats ahead of November's midterm elections.
We have the safest border in the world. If we're not in office, our country will be invaded at levels that made Spain look small time.
Spain's socialist government is taking a different approach to migration. Earlier this year, the government gave residency and work permits to hundreds of thousands of migrants already living in the country without permission.
Morning, Rosie.
Can we just start with the situation as it is now this morning? Without anywhere to go, eat, sleep, Spanish officials say more than 48,000 people had actually voluntarily left to go back to Morocco. Do we know how many people are left?
No, we don't. All the figures are estimates, and they don't actually correspond that closely. So the Spanish Interior Ministry has been putting out figures which are being disputed by the local administration in Ceuta as underestimates. According to the Spanish Interior Ministry, 50,000 Moroccans entered on Thursday, and by last night 48,300 had left, so that leaves only 1,700, but the picture isn't that clear this morning. According to local sources, there are at least 7,000 mostly young, very young Moroccans still wandering aimlessly around Ceuta, sleeping in parks, trying to find water and bread or something to eat.
And I mean, it looks a total mess there. You know, there's inflatables left all over the place. It's also been, I think, a pretty frightening experience for the residents there who've had, you know, people barging into shops, people desperate for food, desperate for places to stay. What's been the advice to the residents of Ceuta?
Yeah, it has been a very traumatic situation. I think the situation at the moment is that most Ceutis are just not going out. They're staying inside. They've been advised to keep off the streets. One of the reasons why so many of Moroccans have returned is that everything is shut down. So all the shops are closed. And in fact, this weekend, the Ceuta is supposed to start a week of its annual feria. It's fair to celebrate its patron saint, and that has been cancelled as well.
Yeah.
The image Ceuta presents is far from being described as a return to normalcy. Although the city center is beginning to recover some of its usual activity, one only needs to leave the main streets to see that the migration crisis remains very present in many parts of the territory. The situation has improved compared to recent days thanks to the continuous returns of immigrants to Morocco, a process that has been carried out uninterruptedly throughout the day. The Benitez neighborhood is one of the clearest examples that Ceuta is still far from returning to normal. Its residents are seeing an unusual sight on their streets where numerous illegal immigrants remain wandering, resting on sidewalks and occupying beach areas. One of the spaces where this situation is most visible is on the beach known as the Trampoline. A high number of people continue to congregate there, although with a different profile than in the first days of the crisis. While initially Moroccan citizens who had accessed Ceuta predominated, their presence has now decreased considerably, and immigrants of sub-Saharan origin are now the majority, especially at the gates of the Sieri. The strip between Benitez and the city has become, for the moment, the main gathering point for immigrants remaining in the city. These are the ones who have not opted to return voluntarily to Morocco and continue to wait for a solution regarding their fate. The area around the Sieri presented an image marked by precariousness during the afternoon. The scene reflected the uncertainty of those waiting without knowing what will happen to them in the coming hours or days. Some tried to distract themselves by playing with a ball. Around 10 p.m. tonight, several national police vans moved to the vicinity of the CED, where agents proceeded to evict a good portion of the people who remained camped in the area. Meanwhile, throughout the afternoon, an image that has already become common since the beginning of this migration crisis repeated itself. National police officers, local police, and military personnel working in coordination on the streets of Ceuta. The units have been deployed in different parts of the city to direct numerous groups of immigrants toward the border with Morocco. On the ground, the military continues to patrol the streets to locate groups of immigrants who remain on sidewalks and in public spaces. Their task is to disperse these gatherings, indicate the way to the border, and advise a return to Morocco. All of this is part of a coordinated effort between the various deployed units, aimed at detecting immigrants who remain in an irregular situation and subsequently accompanying them to the border crossing.
Viewers, this whole thing frames Ceuta as a question for every democratic nation. Should governments wait until migration pressures become visible crisis? Or should they study international experiences early and strengthen policy before confidence in border management begins to erode? We have eroded psychologically in Australia, and the politicians are abusing us with mass immigration for vote harvesting. For Australia, the lesson is presented not as certainty, but as a warning to evaluate policy through the lens of long-term planning. The central message is that migration policy should balance humanitarian commitments with secure borders, effective administration, and the capacity to sustain public confidence over time. There's no point having immigration if it's to the detriment and consequence of the civilization of which is taking the people in.